West Hill United is a progressive spiritual community where how you live is more important than what you believe. West Hill United is a people, a place, an idea. We are a community living out of a progressive faith, striving to make a positive difference in our own lives, the lives of others, and the world. Join us Sundays at 10:30 a.m. or connect with us at any time.
Thank you, Scott. At the end of our readings, we customarily add the phrase, may we, offered as wisdom for the journey. And we invite you to give the response, may we walk in its light. This is just a thought. There's nothing compulsory about it. The first reading is called Why We Need to Rethink the Way We Talk About Resilience. And this is written by the lady who is our speaker today. What could we be if we didn't need to spend energy protecting ourselves against things we shouldn't have to face in the first place? I realize that many of the things I've had to build resilience against, I shouldn't have had to face in the first place. It's true that life isn't fair, but it's also true that when we blindly accept the need to be resilient, others are able to conflate the intentionality of oppression with the capriciousness of life. I had to read that sentence several times. It's true that when we blindly accept the need to be resilient, others are able to conflate the intentionality of oppression with the capriciousness of life. There are two big problems with the way society has championed resilience. One is that it helps to maintain oppression by cementing it as normal, expected, and unavoidable. Racism, ableism, misogyny, transphobia. The reliance on resilience tells us that these are threaded into the fabric of our society, and there's nothing we can really do to extract them. The other problem is that leaning on resilience puts additional pressure on the oppressed. Not only do they experience that dehumanization, but then they're required to do additional work to build up their armor against it. The responsibility to manage said oppression becomes that of the oppressed person. And if you ask me, that goes beyond fairness and into the sphere of systemic disempowerment. That disempowerment may also play into how we, the eternally resilient, see ourselves. Building up that armor in order to protect and preserve ourselves makes sense, but it is a response that can make it more difficult for us to ask for help, open up emotionally, and embrace our vulnerability and our softness. The second reading, very brief in comparison, and it's from a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks called Annie Allen. Let us combine. There are no magics or elves or timely godmothers to guide us. We are lost, must wizard a track through our own screaming weed. Beautifully descriptive. Wizard a track through our own screaming weed. Offered as wisdom for the journey. May we walk in its light.
Thank you, Chris, for leading us through those readings. We're looking forward.
It's my privilege to introduce our speaker this morning. Bee Quammie is truly multi-talented. She is an accomplished freelance writer who has written for notable digital and print publications. She started her writing career with her two blogs, 83 to Infinity and The Brown Sugar Mama, covering topics spanning race and culture to parenthood to health and wellness. Bee weaves captivating and well-crafted stories that engage her audience. She has a gift for creating outstanding messaging, providing communication support and leadership for clients, including non-profit agencies, tech startups, event management companies, law firms, and fashion designers. Bee has created custom web copy, email copy, newsletters, branded content, social media copy, speech writing, retail product content, bio writing, blogs, ghostwriting, and more, would you believe? As a public speaker, she is engaging, compelling, and knowledgeable. She has addressed audiences on topics like diversity and inclusion, anti-Black racism, digital content creation, Black womanhood, pop culture, film, feminism, health and wellness, and more through keynotes, panels, and panel moderation. That's an enormous plateful, and we are very delighted to welcome Bee with the whole, I don't suppose it'll be the whole lot, but a good part of it, which we shall look forward to hearing as Bee talks to us about resilience. Over to you, Bee.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And just even before my introduction, just the warmth in the room and just how beautiful the morning has been so far. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the introduction. Chris, you are, a walking model of resilience right now, not feeling well, but reading those readings like I've never heard them read before. So beautiful job. And I think that last song that we just sung as well, really speaks to the pros of resilience and the things that we really do need to focus on when it comes to thinking about healthy resilience in our own lives. We know, like I said in the piece that I wrote for Chatelaine, life is not fair. Things happen out of our control. Some things happen within our control, but then they don't actually hit us the way we thought they were going to hit us. And we need resilience in order to help us to get through those moments. And I think we can imagine people who maybe don't have the best resilience and the work that we need to do sometimes to support people. And we can see where it's a really important thing to really build that muscle. I think of resilience as a muscle that we need to have strengthened in order to make it through our days, make it through the tough moments, and make it through the ups and downs of life. And that's something. I've got two daughters, they're 10 and 7, and I try to teach them that because they're very convenient with their resilience. Very, very convenient, as children will be. Sometimes when it's something that they want to push through and do, they'll push through and do it. And then my little one will say, but I'm too tired to brush my teeth. I can't do it. And I said, no. The same way you were able to push through when you were exhausted, but you still wanted to go to the park with your friends, we need to employ some of that when you need to brush your teeth. So we'll find a way to make it work. I have had to really dig into my resilience throughout my life, especially in my career. So you heard a bit of my bio. My mom basically sums up everything I do as calling me a professional big mouth. So I started off with writing. I loved to write. When I was a kid, I won a writing competition in my elementary school, and the prize was lunch with Robert Munch, who was my favorite children's book author as a kid, and my favorite to read to my daughters now. And he was one of the first people to tell me I was a good writer, because he read the story I wrote and told me, "Oh, this is fabulous, keep it up." And I'll never forget that day. I remember I sat right beside him. We were in the library. I had a cheese sandwich, a grape juice box. It was a big deal because you never brought food in the library, but we were allowed that day because Robert Munch was here. And I remember going home and telling my parents. They knew that I had already won and knew what the prize was, but they were excited to hear about how my day was. And I think I was probably about 7 or 8 at the time. And I told them how excited I was, and I don't know how I worded it, but I remember the feeling was like, I've got my life mapped out. I'm going to be a writer. Robert Munch said I'm a good writer, so I'm going to be a writer. That's just it. And however I voiced that to my parents, the response back was not as supportive as I was hoping for. So my parents came to Canada from Jamaica, had me and my siblings here, and the idea was always that they came to Canada for a better life, for a better foundation for their children, for us to be able to be successful and support ourselves through life. And you do that in a few different ways. You're either a doctor, a teacher, a lawyer. There's a very limited idea of success for folks who kind of have that mindset. So when I show up saying, well, I'm going to write makeup stories and, that's going to be my life. For them, they still wanted to support me because they saw how much I love to do it, but they were also very concerned about, well, are you going to be able to live? And that was my first moment where I thought, okay, maybe this isn't a thing for me, because in the books that we read in school, none of the authors really looked like me. None of the stories really related to me. So I thought, okay, maybe this isn't something that I'm supposed to do as a career. And so I kind of put that dream aside and went into my second love, which was healthcare, inspired by my mom, who's a nurse. So my first career was in healthcare. And I faced a lot in that space in terms of racism, sexism, ageism, in terms of being in spaces where I was the youngest in management and people did not really respond well to that. So there was a lot that I had to face and build up that resilience muscle just to go to work every day. Eventually, through a long story that I will not divulge and go too deep into now, because that will take us a long time, I ended up transitioning into a career in media. So it started with me creating my blog, my first blog, 83 to Infinity. And that was a response to the stress I was feeling in my day job in healthcare. And I just needed to come home and do something that had nothing to do with what happened in my day. And I could just turn my brain off from that and kind of indulge in something that made me feel good. So I started this blog where I didn't share it with anybody at first. It was just a place I could just write about like whatever Beyonce did that day or something that came up in a conversation with a friend. And I eventually let a few friends read it. They thought it was great. They told me I needed to start sharing it publicly. So I started putting posts on Facebook and on Twitter. That got the attention of editors of magazines and different publications who read my piece and said, would you like to write for me? And I remember my first paying job as a writer, I got paid $25 US to write an article, which was wild to me because I'd been doing all this for free for a long time. You're telling me you're going to pay $25 US, which when I convert that, that's more Canadian. I can go put some gas in my car off of words that I wrote. It was amazing. And so that kind of started my trajectory into moving into something different. So eventually I left healthcare and I went full-time freelance. And the professional big mouth aspect comes into play because I would write things and I felt very comfortable being behind my laptop writing. But I would write certain things and I would get the attention of maybe a TV show producer or a radio show producer who would want me to come on and talk about the thing that I wrote. So that's how I started diving into doing a little bit of radio, doing a little bit of television, which then turned into me doing those things much more frequently, hosting radio shows in the city and doing TV on like CBC, Cityline, The Social, lots of different things. So again, professional big mouth, as my mom likes to just say to her friends. But with that came a new sort of resilience that I needed to build, because I remember doing a segment on CBC on the National, and I think it was my first segment, and I was really excited to see what the feedback was. And I remember they posted it on YouTube, and going through the comments, which is not a good idea to go through the comments, because I did see one, actually a few that were pretty racist, pretty sexist. And I remember getting an email. So somebody actually saw me on the National, found my website, and emailed me through the website to let me know that they don't pay cable to see an N-word, B-word talking about anything. Yeah, exactly. And, you know, in speaking with my producers and speaking with other friends who've kind of been in that media space, the response was, you're gonna have to get a strong backbone. This is the type of thing that you're going to endure as a Black woman who's speaking her mind and being opinionated. And that moment of resilience was really interesting for me because it at once felt like a jail cell, but it felt like freedom at the same time. And I'll explain why. It felt like a jail cell in that there's this idea of inevitability. This is just what you're gonna face. If you want to do this, this is just what you're going to get. And there's nothing I could do to change that. But the freedom of it was, I remember I was talking about something innocuous. I was talking about, because this is kind of during my transition from healthcare, and I remember the federal government was just about to unveil their budget. So I did a segment saying how much I hoped the federal government would put more money consistently into supporting family caregivers. So I thought, who's gonna have a problem with that? But apparently people had a problem with me saying it. But what the freedom that it gave me in that moment of resilience as well was like, it doesn't matter what I do. I don't need to try to contort myself to try to straighten my hair or do something different or change my name or change how I speak, because it doesn't matter what I say. There are always going to be people who are going to have a problem with it. So that was a really interesting moment of resilience where I thought, okay, there's the inevitable, but it also kind of frees me to just be who I'm going to be and do what I want to do. And I remember speaking at a girls rock and roll camp. This was virtually. They were based in London, Ontario, which is my hometown. And this was during the pandemic, so I was living out these ways, but got called in to be a speaker for them to talk about things around resilience, anti-Black racism, fat phobia. These are girls who were aged 8 to 15. And we had a fabulous conversation. And I remember one young girl talking about some of the issues that not she had personally faced, but some of the things her friends had faced. And we were talking about different ways that we can support and be there for people. And in thinking about some of the things that these girls were expressing that they were facing, and the conversations we were having, and them looking to me as kind of this grown woman who can help them, but their conversations are bringing me back to my young self as well, and the resilience I had to build as a young girl growing up. That's when the light bulb kind of went on for me to say, these girls really have to be resilient against things that they shouldn't have to face. And that's when the motor started running for me to think about resilience in a bit of a different way. Because as much as we need this muscle, that muscle can get overworked and fatigued as well. And I find that we often spend so much time building our own resilience or championing others to build their resilience without actually paying much attention to the thing they have to build resilience against, and wondering, what can we do about that so you don't have to continually build this armor, right? So I ended up writing the piece that Chris read so lovely just a few moments ago on the ways that we can think about resilience and the ways that maybe that over-reliance might cause some issues, and made me think about the ways that it can sometimes uphold oppressions. And I'll give a very kind of innocuous, funny example. With my older daughter, a couple years ago, she was complaining about a little boy in her class who kept teasing her, kept bugging her, he kept poking her in class. And I remember my mom was visiting, so she was at home with us. And she's telling me about this story of what he did that day and how she was so annoyed. And I remember my mom said, "Oh, I guess that means he likes you." And I said, "Hold on, no. We're not gonna start that process here, where she now has to build resilience against the ways that this boy is irritating her because he might like her. That's not something I want her to have to spend her energy on. So it led to a really great intergenerational conversation between my daughter, who's about 8 at the time, me, and my mom, in thinking about what are the things that we say are just kind of the way it is. So we're not going to worry about that, but we're going to focus on you and see how strong you are to deal with it. You know what I mean? So that was a moment where I stepped in for my daughter, but it also has led into bigger conversations that I've had with adults as well, the things that we've had to face in our lives, and a really interesting talk that I did once in a very corporate space around resilience. I guess it ended up leading to some tumultuous change for some of management, because in speaking about the fact that sometimes we very often have to build resilience against things that we shouldn't have to be resilient against, it helped some of the employees to show management where they were embodying that in whatever that toxic work environment was, which led to some significant change I heard at the end of it. But it requires us to think a little bit differently, right? It requires us to, instead of looking at that person who's building that resilience, let's focus on the thing. Let's focus on that, and let's see, is there something we can do about that instead? But even when we think about this in terms of societal oppression, like I had mentioned before, racism, ableism, misogyny, there's ways that it can impact us in our personal lives as well. Just before I get to that, though, I'll go back to speak about how I've handled it a little bit when it's been in some of those institutional spaces. So one thing I very much do is I don't check comments. So I've learned not to check the comments. That's just a self-care thing I do for myself. But you can't avoid everything. I'm very active on social media, so people will tweet me or they'll post something on Instagram, and I can't help that. Last summer, I guest hosted The Social. So I know we've got people from all over the place, but everybody's really familiar with The View, the ladies of The View in the US. The easiest way, even though it's not 100% accurate, is The Social is kind of like the Canadian version of The View. We've got a bunch of very smart women around the table. Don't argue as much as The View does. Doesn't get that fiery, but talking about different topics and just really intelligent conversation. So I get to guest host on there every once in a while when one of the main hosts is away. And we were talking about a restaurant somewhere in Toronto that had implemented a new, very strict dress code in order to weed out the undesirable people who were coming to their restaurant. And so we got into this conversation about dress codes. And me being the one Black woman on the panel that day, I spoke about how dress codes have been rooted in racist ideology and bigotry and bias for a long time. And I spoke about my own personal experiences right in downtown Toronto, where you'd think Toronto's the multicultural haven of the world and everybody lives here. And that's very true. But racism is still very much alive, even in the most multicultural of areas. And so I spoke very honestly and clearly about my own experiences, and they posted it on Instagram. Now, whoever's Instagram savvy will know that you can make people a collaborator of your post. So they posted it, they made me a collaborator, so it came up on my profile as well. And within a couple hours, it was flooded. The comments were flooded with the worst racist, sexist, everything you could think of, commentary about me speaking on my personal experiences. And I didn't want to take the post down because I fully believed in everything I said and I thought it needed to be said and be heard. But I also couldn't take the constant opening of my phone and seeing these notifications. And even when I shut the notifications off, I went on Instagram to go look at something else and I'm seeing them all there. So I deleted it off my phone. I gave a friend my Instagram password and I said, you check it and just let me know if anything that I need to be worried about or call the police about comes up, because I've had that happen in situations as well. So I really separated myself from that moment. And for me, resilience was not, I'm going to respond back and I'm going to tell these people why they're wrong. Resilience for me was, I'm not going to deal with it. I'm not I'm not going to touch it. I'm going to just leave that alone because there's nothing worth my attention in that space. And that was how resilience was for me. I had people say, oh, don't you want to put out a statement and go against the people? I said, no, I said what I said. They are reacting to that, and I'm not going to say anything more to justify what I've said, because what I've said is enough. So resilience can look like pushing through, but resilience can also look like saying, I'm not taking this one on. That's not where my energy is going to go. But moving into kind of the personal aspects as well that I was mentioning is, and I'm very open. I like to tell a lot of different stories about my life, and it's all good. But going through divorce was very, very difficult for me. And I remember, as things were happening and my marriage was really imploding, my career was skyrocketing. So it was a very weird thing to be at home and be struggling in this moment. And then I'm booked on Cityline to go chat with Tracy Moore about something really fun. And then I go back home and I'm in this space, and it was really difficult. So when I finally sat some friends down and told them what was happening, the first thing they said was, oh my gosh, you're so resilient. I can't believe you've been dealing with that while you're doing all of this other stuff, and you're out here and you're public and you're in the media, but you're dealing with this. You're so strong, you're so resilient. And the words hit me in a way that I didn't expect, because the last thing I felt was strong. The last thing I felt was resilient. I kind of felt like, yes, all of this is happening in my life, and I feel like everything is about to fall apart, but I refuse to let it take from me what I've built in my career. So it just felt like I just have to show up for this, because this career is mine, and I'm not going to let anything take from it. But I didn't feel strong. I didn't feel resilient. And in that moment, I felt like I couldn't say that. I felt like I would disappoint them to say, actually, I'm not strong. Actually, I'm not resilient. I felt like I had to wear that and own that. And it made me think about my own response to other people going forward, where if I hear somebody sharing marital struggles, they're going through a divorce, they've lost a job, something of that nature, I think back to those moments where I was being touted with being so resilient in the face of my marriage ending, and I give space. So I give space to other people. If somebody comes to me and says, this is what's happening in my life, the first thing I say is, how are you feeling? And I let them have that room to express themselves, to fall apart, to say they feel strong, to say they don't feel strong, whatever it is. I give them that space first. Now, it's really important that we do encourage people. So after I give them that space, I will say, I had no clue all of this was happening, or I didn't know the weight that this was on you. And from my vantage point, I'm so inspired by how you have been managing. I know it's hard. But I still want them to know that I see the effort, that I see them showing up every day. But I don't want that to be the overarching story that takes away from how they might truly be feeling. So I've explained that to other people as well and said, you know what? We love to champion a resilient story. We love to tell people how strong they are. We love to tell people how resilient they are. And we're not lying. But sometimes that's not the full story. And we need to give room for that full story as well. And it makes me really think about just energy and space that we give ourselves when we're thinking about being resilient. So it was a very weird thought that happened one day where something happened, and it's funny because I don't even remember the thing that triggered, and it was just this, I had to put on my armor of resilience because this thing happened. And the one thought that came to my mind was, man, if I didn't have to stress about this, I could be playing the violin again. So I used to play the violin when I was a kid, and I've been dreaming about going back to it. And this thing happened that it was like, all right, got to put back on your armor of resilience and go out in the world. And the violin popped in my mind, and I was like, I could really be practicing and seeing if I remember how to read music instead of doing this. And that's another thing that has made me think about, what could we do with our energy, with our spirits, with ourselves, if we could reserve some of that energy that we have to continuously strengthen in order to show up in the world? So it brings me back to another conversation I had with the young girls at the camp, where we started talking about allyship. As I mentioned, one of the young girls brought up some of the things her friends had faced that she never personally faced herself, but she wanted to know how to show up for them. And I just had this imagery. Sometimes I end up being a very visual thinker. So I told the group, okay, imagine that there's you or the friend on one side, and imagine there's another person on the other side of the street who is going to make a comment or say something that person is going to have to build resilience against. They're going to make fun of their weight. They're going to make fun of their hair or their skin color. Now imagine that comment is an arrow, right? They're going to fire off an arrow. They've got a bow and arrow in their hand, and that comment is that arrow. If that street is just open, that arrow is going to hit yourself or your friend, and they're going to have to learn and build that resilience so the next time the arrow comes, they're a little bit stronger. But if you're standing in the gap, if you are standing in the middle of that street, it might divert the arrow. It might not hit them. And I explained that the way to do that is sometimes to just challenge what that person is saying. If you're in a group, we know, especially with kids, peer pressure, they're in groups, they're saying things and everybody's laughing because it's the most popular kid saying the thing and nobody wants to be the one that's not laughing with the popular kid. And it can be difficult, but maybe you say, why would you say that about her? Why would you make fun of that? That's not nice. Something that simple to challenge that arrow that they're going to fire off might be the one thing that makes them stop in that moment. So we kind of ended up in an impromptu way working through some scripting, because I said, listen, I know how difficult it is. I know how difficult it can be to be that person who's going to stand in the gap. But what we need are people to stand in that gap. And I think about that with adults as well. We need people to challenge the things that people have to build resilience against. We need people to ask those uncomfortable questions or to put those challenges forth to make somebody else really think about the impact of what it is that they're doing and saying. Because the really unfair thing, and I mentioned it in the piece that was read a little while ago as well, is the weight that we place on ourselves and other people and the way that we judge how resilient someone is also becomes a very unfair aspect of building this resilience muscle. I have a number of friends who have dealt with cancer in their lives, and I have a friend who's very triggered around this time of year because October, Breast Cancer Month, everything is pink, we're freeing the tatas, we're doing booby balls and all of these things, and she's very triggered because the stories come forward about survivors, people who've been resilient. And she said something to me the other day where she said, you know, I'm lucky I'm still here, but there are other people who are not here, and it's not because they weren't resilient. It's not because they weren't strong. So what are we championing when we uphold some people and say, you're here because you're resilient? Don't know about those other people who didn't make it, but you're resilient, you did it, and that was your reward, is now you are here. And that's just another thing that we do sometimes with a bit of this toxic positivity. We don't leave room. We don't leave room for other people's truths and other people's experiences. And we don't look at the thing that people are being forced to build resilience against. So the other aspect that comes into this when we think about building a healthy resilience, I've talked a lot about some of the struggles and the things that we need to really consider with our over-reliance. But like I said in the beginning, we need resilience. We need to be able to push through things and keep ourselves going. Is self-care. Right? Self-care is extremely important. My phone screen just shut off exactly when I didn't want it to, but let me get back in so I can read this quote. So self-care, you know, it's one of those things that's commodified and packaged as get bath bombs and, you know, take a nap and, you know, get a face mask. And those things are great. Those things are lovely. But the poet and activist Audre Lorde wrote something once that says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And in her full piece where that quote comes from, this is a time, she is a woman who, she died of breast cancer a couple decades ago. And these were her cancer journals. That's what this book of poetry was called. So she was speaking about being somebody who is living with cancer and still finding a way to take care of herself in a world that felt very anti that. So I take her words to say the self-care thing is not just the baths, it's not just the face masks. It's being able to say no when you need to say no. It's being able to choose yourself when you need to choose yourself, which for me, as an eldest daughter in an immigrant family, is very hard to do very often because a lot of people want you to do stuff for them first. But it is those things that are more difficult. It is the things that we do to shift kind of the narrative and shift the experiences. It's the ways that in my media career, there have been things that I have turned down and said, no, I'm not going to do it. And people think I'm wild for turning it down. But I turn it down because I know what it's going to lead to, and it's not something I want to deal with. There are other ways I can challenge myself, and I'm very discerning about how I do that. It's being able to speak very clearly to people and let them know, maybe in moments where they have failed you. So an example, I shared this, I was just on the social last week, and we were talking about awkward job interviews. It was just a funny little light moment to end the segment. And I brought up an example of an exit interview that I had in my last job in healthcare, which kind of should have shown me the signs that I was about to kind of leave the industry. But I was working in healthcare, and it was a very, when I talk about resilience, that was a place that I really had to build resilience against. It was an organization where I worked with adults with developmental disability, and I supervised group homes. And I dealt with a lot of racism. I was apparently given 2 specific homes because as the only Black woman in the supervisory level, those 2 homes had staff that were apparently notably racist. So the management thought, well, if they need to report to a Black woman, they won't be racist anymore. But what they did was just give them a new target to be racist against, knowing that they were not going to ever, face any retribution because they hadn't all the time that they'd been employed. It got to the point where I remember leading a team meeting one day, and literally thought I was having a heart attack. So I called the meeting, I closed it, I took myself to the hospital, told them I'm having a heart attack. They took it very seriously. It turned out to be a panic attack. And I remember that, they did all the checks. They said, your heart's fine, you're okay. We'll have you come back to the cardiac clinic tomorrow to do a stress test. And I walked into the waiting room, and there was a lot of older people there. So they're all kind of looking at me like, what are you doing here? And I remember one really lovely gentleman said, listen, I know this is your personal business, but what's going on? And I said, listen, I don't know. I thought I was having a heart attack yesterday. Anyways, when I decided to leave that job, I submitted my 2-week resignation. And the walls in our main office were very thin, so you could hear a lot of conversations happening. And I heard my manager in the office beside me call the HR manager who was across the office and let them know that I had given in my 2 weeks notice. I couldn't really hear what the HR manager was saying, but I heard my direct manager say, I guess she's just not the star we thought she was. And I was not the star they thought I was because I wasn't going to put up with it anymore, right? So what I did, and going back to the story I shared on the social, is I called an exit interview with my manager, with our executive director, with the HR manager. I let them know exactly what I heard. I let them know all the ways, itemized the ways they have failed me, the things I had brought to their attention that they did nothing about, the various things that I had written down dates and times and quotes and everything, and their lack of response, and I laid it all out. And it was kind of like a movie, like I just did this thing, and then it was like I got up and left, and I just felt so empowered, and they were just sitting there, jaws dropped, and that was that. And I just walked out and like flicked my hair, and it was a moment. But that was part of resilience for me. It wasn't, I'm gonna keep putting up with this and show you that I can put up with it. It's no, I'm gonna challenge you. You're not gonna do any better for me, but maybe you'll do better for the next person so they won't have to build that same resilience, right? So there's different ways that we can go about self-care. One thing I do say to folks tangibly though, when it comes to the things that we need to do for ourselves individually, is make your self-care list when you're feeling great. One thing that I've learned far too often is I'll be like, teetering on the edge of burnout. And that's when I try to figure out, okay, what do I need to do? Do I need a nap? Do I need the face mask? Do I need to find some money and go, eat, pray, love somewhere? And that's not the time to figure it out. You want to give yourself a gift by making that list of kind of immediate things you can do, longer term things you can do, and maybe like structural change things you can do that will give you that self-care. So when you get to that moment of stress or get to that moment of feeling burnt out, all you have to do is pull out your list and pick what you're able to do in that moment, and just give your future self that gift so that they're not stressed out trying to figure out what to do with themselves in that moment. And it's really important too when we think about self-care, especially when we're trying to balance resilience, because resilience, it takes our energy. Resilience requires energy, so you've got to give yourself something back in order to have that be sustainable. You need to think rest, and you need to think rejuvenation. So the reason why I kind of came to this thought was I've had some time off that I've taken in work where it's been like a weekend and I'm like, I'm not doing anything. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just laying on the couch. I'm vegging out. I'm just binging movies and TV shows, and that's all I'm doing. And then Monday, I'm back to the real world, and I kind of feel like, yeah, I'm rested, but I'm kind of missing something. And usually I realize I just didn't do anything fun. I did a little too much of the nothing, and I didn't do something to give me a little jolt of energy. On the flip side, I've had a number of vacations where I've gone off. I love carnival, so I'll travel through the islands in the Caribbean and play mass and do carnival. And you're going from sun up to sundown overnight. You're at parties at 2 a.m, then you're going back to the hotel and you're changing for a boat cruise at lunchtime, and you go back to the hotel, you're changing for a party at nighttime. And it's great till I come home, and then I go back to work, and they're like, oh my gosh, how was your week off? You must be so rested. And I'm like, no, I need a vacation from the vacation now because I got no rest. So it's really important that we have both. So when you're making that self-care list for yourself, think about what are the rest factors, what are the rejuvenation factors, right? It's really, really important. But I think overall, just to kind of close out, is thinking about how these things, when we're thinking about our relationship with resilience, we need to think about our own internal relationship with resilience and where it's been healthy or where it's been unhealthy. We also need to think about the ways we respond to others with resilience. Are we kind of paving over a story by giving them this resilience armor to put on and only celebrating that? Are we standing in the gap for people when we can so that they have one less thing to build resilience against? But it's just really, really critical that we think of ourselves as a collective and as a community. And that's why I included that one reading from Gwendolyn Brooks and her poem. Her poetry book, the full book is actually called Annie Allen. And it's a poetry book that tells the story of a young Black girl named Annie Allen from childhood to womanhood. And this is one of the pieces that was in there. So I'll read it once again. Let us combine. There are no magics or elves or timely godmothers to guide us. We are lost, must wizard a track through our own screaming weed. So the ending sounds very solitary, that we must wizard a track through our own screaming weed. But the first sentence is, let us combine. So if we're not looking to the magics and the elves and the godmothers, if we're looking to the people who are around us, we can combine and we can wizard a track through our own screaming weed to healthy resilience and just a better way of supporting each other throughout those journeys as well. And I'll just leave it there. So thank you so much to everybody in the hall, everybody online, everybody in the room. Thank you so much. And I should say just a special thank you, John McKechnie. We had a lovely conversation as we were kind of prepping for this. So John, you've been lovely. Thank you so much for being supportive. Annie, I'm not sure if Annie is on, but Annie as well. Oh, okay, yes. There's John, yes. Is Annie online or maybe she's not? Her name is there? Anyways, well, Annie, shouting you out as well. And thank you so much, Scott, for welcoming me so much and having me. And to you all as well. You all have been lovely.
Become a sustaining champion of West Hill United's work by committing to an automatic monthly donation. Learn more or donate now through Canada Helps.